Daniel Cross had built his life on silence, a silence so deep it seemed to stretch across the empty valleys that surrounded his ranch, where the grass swayed in the wind like waves on a forgotten sea, and the creaking of old wooden beams echoed louder than any human voice. Years ago, when he left behind the smoke of battlefields and the restless chatter of crowded cities, he thought he wanted nothing more than to disappear, to live where no one could remind him of the things he had lost. And so, he bought the land nobody wanted, a patch of soil so dry and cracked that even the stars above seemed tired of shining on it, but he stayed, tending to his small herd of animals, repairing fences that always broke again, and watching the seasons pass like shadows on a wall. And though loneliness weighed heavily on his shoulders, he found strange comfort in routine, telling himself that this was peace. This was all he deserved after so many years of running from memories. Yet, as much as Daniel wished to vanish, the galaxy had a way of finding those who hid, and it began on a night when the wind carried a sound that did not belong to the earth, a sound sharp and metallic, something like machinery grinding far away. And when the sensors at the edge of his property blinked red for the first time in months, his hand tightened instinctively around the old rifle leaning by the door, the same rifle he swore he would never use again. But the habit of caution returned as naturally as breathing, and he stepped outside into the cold night where the horizon stretched endless and dark, broken only by the pale glow of the moons. He waited, his eyes straining against the shadows, until movement caught his attention. Slow, deliberate shapes making their way across the dusty plain, 11 figures cloaked in strange fabric that shimmered faintly under moonlight, and though Daniel had seen many kinds of travelers before, smugglers, drifters, traders who lost their way, these were different, their walk heavy with grief, their silence louder than words, and as they drew closer, the edges of their faces became visible, features not human but delicate, carved with lines of sorrow, their eyes too large and luminous to belong to any person of earth. Daniel's first instinct was to retreat, to lock his doors and pretend none of this was happening, for he had promised himself never to be dragged into other people's battles again. But as he stood there, heart beating in his chest, like a war drum, he could not ignore the way they looked at him, not with threat but with pleading, as if the long road had finally led them to the last person who might listen. One of them stepped forward, her posture weary but strong, and though her voice carried a strange rhythm, he understood her words clearly through the translator device clasped to her wrist. She spoke of war, of homes burned to ash, of husbands lost on distant battlefields, of a people scattered and hunted across the stars, and though Daniel wanted to shut his ears, the weight of her sorrow dug into him like an old wound, for he too knew the sting of war and the hollow ache of loss. He could see that these 11 travelers were widows, marked by grief so sharp it seemed woven into their very skin, and their presence unsettled him deeply, for he had spent so long pushing away memories of his own family, of comrades who never came home, of nights spent under alien skies filled with fire. Yet here they were, reminders in living form, knocking on the gates of his solitude. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle, torn between fear and duty, and for a moment he considered turning them away, sending them back into the desert night where the cold would swallow them whole. But then his gaze drifted to the youngest among them, her steps faltering, her shoulders trembling beneath the weight of exhaustion, and something within him cracked, a voice whispering that peace built on ignoring others was no peace at all, and so he lowered the rifle slowly, his words rough from disuse as he asked them what they wanted, though deep down he already knew. Shelter, food, water, a chance to survive one more day in a galaxy that had taken everything from them, and though Daniel hesitated, though he felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitude shatter, he finally stepped aside, opening the gate to his ranch, and with that single motion, his years of silence came to an end, for as the 11 alien widows crossed his threshold, bringing with them their sorrow, their secrets, and their shadows, Daniel Cross could not yet know that his lonely ranch had just become the center of a storm far greater than the quiet life he once thought unshakable. Daniel Cross had not spoken to anyone in years, yet now his quiet ranch was filled with the sound of soft voices, whispers in a language that drifted like wind through broken glass, and though their translator devices worked well enough for him to understand, there was still something haunting in the way the alien widows spoke, their words heavy as if each syllable carried the weight of graves. And as they sat by the dim fire he had built in the yard, Daniel studied them with the suspicion of a man who had seen too many tricks, for the galaxy was never kind and no one came without reason. But when his eyes moved from one face to the next, he saw no deception, only exhaustion and grief so raw that it made his chest tighten. They told him fragments of their story, each widow adding pieces like broken shards of glass forming a picture, and Daniel listened though he tried not to, learning how their husbands had fought in a war that the human colonies had only heard whispers about, a war fought not for territory but for silence, because the men who had died carried knowledge that powerful factions wanted buried forever, knowledge these widows now carried in their hearts and minds, and that truth had made them targets. As they spoke, Daniel's instincts warned him that their presence here was not chance, that their journey had been guided, perhaps even chased, right to his doorstep, and though he wanted to believe he could simply give them water and send them on their way, the thought of 11 weary travelers stumbling back into the night felt wrong, like throwing wounded animals to the wolves, yet part of him recoiled at the idea of involvement, because involvement meant risk, and risk was the one thing he had sworn never to embrace again. But even as he considered it, he caught sight of faint lights flashing far out in the valley, low and steady like hunters marking their prey, and his blood ran cold because he had seen such lights before, years ago in war zones, where scouts moved silently ahead of the killing force, and now he realized what the widows had not yet said out loud. Someone was following them, someone relentless, and by opening his gate Daniel might have already painted a target on his ranch. Still, he did not speak of the lights, not yet, for he wanted to understand them more, to test whether these women were truly helpless or hiding something darker. So he let them rest in his barn where hay and cloth offered at least some comfort, and from the shadows of his porch he watched them, noticing how they never slept deeply, always waking at the slightest sound, their hands drifting near hidden pouches or small devices they carried, and this confirmed for him what his instincts had already whispered. These widows were more than wanderers, they were survivors trained by tragedy, perhaps even ready to fight if cornered, and though he respected that fire, it also made him uneasy, for if they could fight, then surely their enemies would be greater still. Daniel stayed awake that night, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the valley stretched endless and silent, and as the wind carried a low hum of engines far beyond the hills, he knew his days of quiet were already gone, replaced by a storm that was slowly closing in, and though part of him wished to send them away before the danger truly arrived, another part, the soldier buried deep within him, stirred with an old truth he had tried to forget, that sometimes, no matter how far you run, the fight still finds you. Daniel Cross had not shared his home with anyone for years, and though the walls of his ranch had grown used to silence, they now echoed with quiet movements of 11 strangers who did not belong to this world, and as dawn broke across the dry valley, painting the sky in pale orange light, he found himself uneasy with their presence even as he laid out bread, water, and old blankets for them, because kindness did not erase the truth that they carried shadows behind their tired eyes, shadows that whispered of danger drawing near, and while they thanked him softly, their voices edged with sorrow, Daniel noticed how they never truly relaxed, how their gaze often drifted toward the horizon as if expecting something to appear, and he realized they were not simply seeking shelter, they were running from something relentless. Throughout the day he worked on the fences and tried to busy his hands, but his mind circled around questions that would not rest, wondering why they had come to him. Of all people, a forgotten rancher living far from trade routes, and the more he thought, the more the answer unsettled him, for coincidences were rare in the galaxy and fate had a cruel way of finding him whenever he tried to stay hidden. So when he spotted one widow lingering near the barn, studying the crude sensors he had placed along the property line, he walked over quietly and asked what she thought of them, and she looked at him with eyes far older than her face, telling him the devices were clever but far too simple to stand against what pursued them. Her words struck like a cold wind, and Daniel pressed for more, until she confessed that their husbands had once carried knowledge that could shatter powerful empires, secrets that had cost them their lives, and now the widows carried fragments of that same knowledge, hunted across star systems by mercenaries who would never stop, and though she spoke calmly, Daniel heard the tremor in her tone, the fear she tried to hide, and it made his heart beat harder because if they were telling the truth, then his ranch had just become the last line between them and destruction. That night he could not sleep, pacing between windows, rifle in hand, watching for any sign of movement beyond the fences, and though the valley appeared empty, a strange unease pressed on him, the sense of eyes watching from the dark hills, and his unease deepened when one of his sensors flickered faintly, then went dead, not broken but cut, and Daniel knew then that the hunters were already near, testing his defenses, waiting for the right moment, and though he wanted to wake the widows, to demand they leave before his land became a battlefield, he hesitated, because something inside him, The soldier who had once fought for strangers he barely knew, whispered that sending them away would only condemn them to certain death. Still, suspicion gnawed at him, for he did not yet fully trust these women who carried secrets like hidden weapons, and as he watched them sleeping in the barn, their faces lit faintly by lantern glow, he wondered if they were truly victims or if they carried dangers of their own, dangers that might burn his ranch to ashes before dawn. And in that moment of doubt, Daniel realized he was no longer a man living in solitude but a guardian standing at the edge of a storm, uncertain whether the people he protected were a blessing or the spark of his ruin. Daniel Cross had lived with ghosts long before the widows arrived, but as the days passed and their voices filled the quiet corners of his ranch, the old memories he had buried began to stir like bones unearthed by a restless wind, and it was on the fourth night, while the widows huddled close around the barn fire, that one of them finally spoke in detail about the shadows chasing them, her words spilling like broken glass across the floor of Daniel's mind, for she told him that their husbands had once fought alongside humans in distant sectors, battles Daniel himself remembered hearing whispers of during his service, battles marked not only by blood but by betrayal, where entire units vanished and reports were buried under classified seals, and as she spoke, Daniel realized with a cold shiver that these widows carried knowledge of events he had once suspected but never confirmed, truths that powerful men and alien factions alike had silenced by fire and steel, and now those same truths were carried in fragile memories, hidden in the hearts of women who had lost everything. Daniel listened in silence, but with each word the weight on his shoulders grew heavier, because if these widows were right, then the hunters cutting his sensors and lurking in the valley were not just mercenaries. They were agents sent to erase history itself, to kill anyone who carried even the faintest spark of that knowledge. And Daniel knew from experience that such enemies would never stop until their mission was finished. That night he could not rest, his mind dragged back to his own ghosts, comrades who had fallen screaming in alien mud, families he had failed to protect when orders came too late, and the bitter taste of regret filled his mouth as he realized he had spent years running from those ghosts only for them to find him again in the form of 11 widows who stared at him with trust he did not think he deserved. By morning, Daniel had made a choice he told no one. He began reinforcing the ranch, moving quietly as he dug out old crates from beneath the floorboards, weapons and equipment he swore he would never touch again, relics of his past that smelled of oil and war, and as he worked, some of the widows watched with silent recognition, their eyes betraying that they too had seen such tools before, and in their silence Daniel understood they were not as helpless as they seemed, that survival had carved steel into their bones just as it had into his. But what unsettled him most was not their strength, it was the strange sense that their arrival at his ranch had never been random, as though fate, or perhaps something darker, had guided them to the one man who could not turn away, and that thought kept him restless, because he wondered if they had chosen him, or if someone had chosen him for them. As the sun set again and the valley grew cold, Daniel walked the perimeter with his rifle and spotted movement in the hills, quick flashes of light like mirrors catching moon glow, and he knew then that the hunters were closer than ever, waiting for night to fall completely before striking, and though his blood told him to prepare for war, another part of him felt the old ache of dread, because battles had a way of digging up more than enemies. They dragged up ghosts, and Daniel feared that when the fighting came, he would not only face mercenaries in the dark, but the weight of every choice he had ever tried to forget. Night fell heavy on the valley, the sky thick with stars that gave no comfort, and Daniel Cross stood on his porch with his rifle across his chest, every muscle in his body taut with the knowledge that the hunters had finally come, for the sensors he had repaired flickered one by one, not with natural failure but with deliberate cuts, each spark in the dark hills like a message that the noose was tightening, and though the widows remained inside the barn, their silhouettes faint against the lantern glow, Daniel could feel their unease pressing against him like the weight of a storm, because they too knew that this night would not pass in silence. When the first drone appeared, hovering low with a red eye scanning the ground, Daniel raised his rifle and shot clean through its core, the explosion shattering the quiet and echoing across the valley, and at once the hills came alive with movement, shadows rushing forward, shapes darting between rocks, the low hum of engines growing into a roar as more drones and armored vehicles crept down the slopes, and Daniel's blood surged with the old rhythm of battle, the part of him he had tried to bury clawing its way back to the surface, sharp and merciless, because here there was no time for hesitation, there was only survival. The widows spilled from the barn, some clutching strange alien devices, others carrying nothing but determination. And Daniel realized that though grief weighed on them, they were not broken. They had trained with their husbands, they knew how to fight, and as beams of searing light cut through the darkness, they joined him at the barricades he had built from old wood and steel, returning fire with precision that surprised him, their weapons spitting bursts of energy that tore through enemy drones, and for a brief moment Daniel felt the strange thrill of standing shoulder to shoulder with allies once more, a feeling he thought he would never know again. But the enemy was relentless, waves of mercenaries in dark armor pressing closer, shouting commands in guttural tongues, their fire forcing Daniel to retreat step by step. Yet every time he faltered the widows covered him, their coordination uncanny, as though they had rehearsed this moment for years, and though the air grew thick with smoke and the ranch shook under the blasts, something inside him burned brighter. The old fire of defiance that whispered humanity was never as weak as the galaxy believed, and with each enemy that fell, Daniel shouted commands he hadn't spoken in years, his voice strong and clear, guiding the widows, shifting their positions, turning scattered resistance into organized defense, until the mercenaries who had expected an easy slaughter found themselves trapped in a deadly stalemate. Still, Daniel knew this was only the beginning, that the hunters would throw everything they had until his ranch was nothing but ash, and as he reloaded, sweat stinging his eyes, he saw in the distance the faint outline of something larger moving down the hill, a war machine bristling with cannons, and in that moment Daniel understood that his quiet life had ended not with a whisper, but with a siege that would either forge him into something greater than the man he had been, or bury him alongside the ghosts he had carried for so long. When dawn finally broke over the valley, the sky was painted in smoke and fire, the once quiet land scarred with craters and broken machines, and Daniel Cross stood among the wreckage with his rifle lowered, his body heavy with exhaustion but his spirit strangely alive, for the hunters had been driven back, their dead and broken machines scattered across the hills like forgotten bones, and though victory felt fragile, it was real, a triumph carved not by numbers or power but by will, courage, and a refusal to surrender. Yet as Daniel looked upon the widows, their faces streaked with dirt and ash, their eyes still sharp despite the pain, he knew that what had happened was only the beginning, because by choosing to stand with them, he had stepped into a story larger than his own solitude, a story filled with enemies who would not forget their defeat. The widows gathered around him, their voices low but steady, thanking him not with grand words but with simple gestures, the kind born from people who understood the cost of survival, and as Daniel listened, he realized his ranch, once empty and forgotten, now carried new life, laughter faint between the grief, determination stronger than despair, and though the land itself bore scars of battle, it felt less lonely than it ever had before, as if the walls and fields themselves recognized the weight of purpose returned. Still, Daniel could not shake the knowledge that the galaxy would not let them rest, for word would spread. Hunters would regroup, and storms greater than the skirmish would come, but instead of dread, he felt a quiet strength, the same strength that had carried him through wars long ago, only now it burned brighter because he was no longer fighting alone. In the silence after battle, he found himself repairing fences not just for himself but for the 11 who now walked his land with steady steps. And when he looked at them he no longer saw only sorrow. He saw resilience, the will to rebuild, and he realized that their presence had done more than disturb his peace. It had given him a reason to live again, to protect, to fight not as a man haunted by ghosts but as a guardian of new bonds. And so the ranch became something different, no longer a place of retreat but a refuge where hope could grow, where the widows carried their secrets safely for now, and where Daniel, once a man resigned to solitude, became the anchor of a fragile family forged by loss and defiance. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield that had been his home, he felt the weight of his past finally lift, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, one that would test him again and again, but one he would face with the courage of a soldier and the heart of a man who had at last remembered what it meant to live for others.